Well, I think we'll get underway, and I'm sorry that there are more here. But I did read that there's a gathering on the steps of Parliament House at this very time about introducing the voice to Parliament in the South Australian Parliament.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
So whether people from that we could expect here or there, I don't know. But anyway, we work with who we are. Oh, here's some more coming. Yeah, they're more, you know.
Yeah, that's okay. We can wait another 10 minutes if you want. I don't mind. I'm not in a rush.
Okay. Oh, is he coming here or going somewhere? Oh yeah, he's booking in.
Yeah.
He's just going to go to the loo and he's coming in.
Okay.
I think it was the reading in Parliament. I think they were voting in Parliament this afternoon, possibly. Still getting through the second layer of Parliament today. That's what I understood.
Right.
That could be what they.
But I did read somewhere, I don't know where I read it, that everybody was invited to come and stand on the steps of Parliament House.
And I think they were voting on the 26th, which is next Sunday.
Oh, yeah, that's right. It's the 20th. For some reason I think it was 26th, but you're right. It's the 26th.
Right.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Okay, so welcome to those who are here, which is the cream of the crop. And we'll first do an acknowledgement of country, acknowledging that we meet on Kaurna land of the Adelaide Plains, and we honour the Kaurna elders, past and present, as the traditional owners and custodians of the land. We recognise First Nations people as the oldest living cultures in the world, and we commit to walking together into the future, especially in this year of history making on a First Nations voice to Parliament. And a special welcome to Cheryl, who, would you like to sit in the front circle, because we don't necessarily want any back row people. Then we're all one, easier for Cheryl to talk to us. Now, I want to do a bit of an introduction on Cheryl, because I'm delighted that she's here, and I've spoken to Cheryl and emailed her numerous times, because I've also been involved with her talking somewhere else. And there's a lot to say about Cheryl. Cheryl is a proud Narungga woman who is passionate about improving the quality of life for her people. She has spent the last 40 years within the Aboriginal community, in the federal government and the South Australian government, working to improve the lives of First Nations peoples. She has experience working with the Aboriginal community sector in law and justice, women's issues, family violence, youth justice, child and family services, and is currently head of the Aboriginal Housing Unit with the South Australian Housing Authority. Cheryl is committed to influencing positive change and outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And in her presentation today, I hope this is still accurate, Cheryl will draw on her extensive experience as the former CEO of the Aboriginal Legal Rights Movement, as National Co-Chair of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Services, and as National Co-Chair of Change the Record, campaigning to end the incarceration and family violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Cheryl is committed to promoting the self-determination of her people and strongly opposing any forced interventions, including income management or any initiative that contravenes basic human rights. And then this next bit I love. Cheryl has a dream where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians are treated with respect and dignity, enjoy a life without racism, enjoy a longer life expectancy, have real jobs, live a life without poverty, and have stable and affordable housing, access to quality education, and are empowered to make all their own decisions. And that is a magnificent dream, very broad-ranging, I would say, and we hope that in making history this year, that that's just another step in achieving those dreams. So, with your broad and vast knowledge of things, we're delighted to welcome you today and to hear what you have to say about Black Lives Matter. Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you, Esmond, and thank you for such a lovely warm welcome, everybody. I'd just like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of this beautiful country that we're all standing on today, the land of the Kaurna peoples. I pay my respect to all Kaurna peoples, past, present, and elders, past, present, and emerging.
Fergus, could the mic be a bit closer?
Is that better? How's that? Is that better?
I'm sure you'd be perfectly right, just coming forward a bit.
Yeah.
We don't want to miss what you're saying.
Thank you very much.
That's much better.
So today, my little talk, I suppose, is around about ending Australia's mass incarceration crisis, why Black Lives Matter, and why voting yes is important with the referendum. So as you already know, I'm a proud Narungga woman. My peoples are the traditional owners of the lands of the York Peninsula of SA, and really pleased to share with everybody today that just this last Tuesday, we actually have received our native title right determination on our wonderful country. So we're really, really proud of that fact and that achievement and the acknowledgement and the recognition. I'm also the National Co-Chair of Change Record. We're Australia's only first nationally led coalition, Aboriginal coalition, of legal health, social justice and family violence. Prevention experts, we campaign to end incarceration of and family violence against our people. We also have a great membership of colleagues, probably around about 18 or 19 different human rights, legal and social justice agencies who support our cause. And I'm also a board member of the South Australian Council of Social Services, also known as SACOS, which is the South Australian peak body for non-government health and community services sector in South Australia. And we envision a future of justice, opportunity and shared wealth for all Australians. And I'm also fortunate enough to be a board member of the Jindu Foundation. For many Aboriginal language groups across Australia, Jindu is the word for sun or sunshine. And it encapsulates the intent of our foundation to help Aboriginal children and young people grow, develop and shine brightly as our future leaders. It is really wonderful to be with you all today on the unceded land of the Kaurna people. And as you can see by my community involvement in the above mentioned communities, I actively get involved and try to make positive change to highlight the ongoing injustices and how it impacts on the lives of our most vulnerable peoples in our society, which is our First Nations peoples. As you heard, I've been working in the area of social justice for around about 40 years. And dedicated my life to working towards achieving social justice for my people. During the last 40 years, I've seen a lot of changes, working within and outside of the system. And it's about the system that I suppose I focus on a lot when I talk about institutionalisation and the impacts that it actually has had and continues to have on my people. But I haven't seen the necessary changes, despite the many reports and recommendations that are still yet to be either released or have their recommendations implemented, that could change the current intergenerational mass incarceration crisis in Australia. As I've mentioned, Change Record is the only national First Nations-led justice coalition, and we have been doing quite a lot of work in the space of late. One of the key areas that tricky areas that we've been really promoting is raising the age of criminal responsibility from aged 10 to 14 years of age, and we've been advocating that nationally. Northern Territory has recently raised the age for going up to age 12, and we're hoping that in South Australia that our government here will consider raising the age to 14 years of age. And the reason why that's important is because when we look at the impact of First Nations children in the age group, particularly from 10 to 14 years of age, our children on average make up around about 60% of children who are incarcerated in the age group. So it's actually quite appalling, when we look at the Royal Commission recommendations on Aboriginal deaths in custody that really talks about looking at alternatives to incarceration and looking at early intervention, prevention type programs within communities. And one of the other things that we've been really advocating strongly for, we change the record, is the justice reinvestment type programs and initiatives that we are calling upon government to fund, both state and territory governments and also Commonwealth, to provide the alternatives to imprisonment for our future generations. So I want to talk to you about the mass crisis of incarceration in Australia. Specifically the colonial crisis, that means Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the most incarcerated group of people in the entire world, not just Australia. The struggle to ensure that Black Lives Matters, the way that White Lives Matters, is a struggle that our people of colour are fighting all over the world. Aboriginal people in Australia are the most incarcerated people on earth, and we know the pain that Black America felt in the wake of George Floyd's death, because it is a pain that we feel too. When George Floyd's brutal death started waves of protest here and around the world, we added our voices and called for change. But the reality is, First Nations peoples have been fighting for justice in Australia for quite a long time. We have experienced violence at the hands of police, correctional services and within youth justice facilities since colonisation. Yet the level of violence we experience and the number of deaths that have occurred within these facilities do not often raise concerns across Australia with non-Aboriginal communities. We really need to take a good look at ourselves and take action, rather than sit in silence and, I suppose, blaming my people for the circumstances they find themselves in, which is due to racism and over-policing. We appear to be more comfortable calling out the injustice that happens to non-Aboriginal women and children than we do for our First Nations people. This is quite evident when we actually look at the media, and when we actually have significant stories, that impact on non-Aboriginal families, and yet a lot of our causes and a lot of situations that impact on our First Nations people do not raise an eyebrow with some media outlets. I ask each of you today to reflect about why this is. I'd be very interested in your thoughts. In Australia, over 500 people have died in custody since the 1991 Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, without anyone being convicted, and with only 2 cases that I can only think of where charges were laid. But guess what? There were no convictions. The conviction of Derek Chauvin in USA, who has been found guilty of the murder of George Floyd, is a small step towards accountability. But the conviction of one police officer will not fix a deeply racist, broken policing system. Here in Australia, we're still waiting for that accountability. There has not been one single conviction for the approximate 500 of our people who have died in police or in prison cells. The 1991 Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody was meant to put an end to our people dying in cells. There were 339 recommendations that were made. Its recommendations have been repeated in numerous reports, inquiries and coronial inquests, and yet the majority of them have not been implemented. We have lost too many lives to tell all the stories. In September 2019, Miss Clark was shot by police in Geraldton, Western Australia. She died in hospital. On the 9th of November 2019, teenager Commodore Walker was shot by police and killed in Union, Northern Territory. In both cases, police officers were charged with murder. But the question remains whether justice will ever be delivered. There'll be no accountability and no justice in Australia until police stop investigating police, and same within the prison systems, that we don't have prisons investigating their own incidences, and that we must have independent and transparent oversight of our police and the prisons and also our youth justice systems. Our people are put into prisons at the highest rate in the world. We are incarcerated because of poverty, discriminatory policies and over-policing. Our children are taken away from their parents and are locked up in youth detention centres at far higher rates than non-Indigenous children. And we do not need to look to America or other countries to see the consequences of systemic racism and discrimination, because we can see it right here. We are on the verge of overtaking the United States as the country who locks up more of our people than anywhere else in the world. Mass incarceration is tearing our families and communities apart, and it steals our children's futures and it ruins their lives. If any other policy decision by government caused so much harm, we would be up in arms. So my question is, why isn't there widespread outrage and demands to change the policy decisions that are driving our people into police and prison cells? Is it because since colonisation, governments, police, law enforcement forces and white men in power have very successfully painted Aboriginal people as the problem, rather than the discriminatory laws, policies and policing that causes us so much harm? So let's go back to how this started. We cannot really talk about mass incarceration without talking about colonisation and the enduring, ongoing legacy of colonisation of First Nations people everywhere. Australia's criminal legal system targets people based on the basis of their race, their Aboriginality and their wealth. From housing policy to the social security system, right through to police targeting and harassment, it is black, brown and poor people who are the victims of law enforcement and incarceration. It wasn't so long ago that Australia's legal system was built on taking our land, stealing our wealth, ensuring money stayed in the hands of the wealthy, white landowners. Some things have changed since then, but many have not. Today, Australia is more unequal than it has been in 75 years. Recent Australian Bureau of Statistics data shows that the top 20% of income earners earn almost as much as the other 80% of households combined. There is no doubt that the richer are getting richer while the life gets tougher for everyone else. Prisons and police are being used to respond to this inequality. Instead of addressing poverty, we're locking up people more than we have since 1899. Numbers have risen 130% since 1985, and this is despite governments saying that crime rates are plummeting over that same period. For all the governments talk about closing the gap, well, they're still sending our children to prison and they're still taking them from our homes. So how do government policies drive mass incarceration? I often talk about discrimination at every point in the system. It starts before our kids are born, with discriminatory laws and policies, meaning that their Aboriginal father is more likely to be imprisoned than university educated. The Aboriginal mother is 30 times more likely to be hospitalised from family violence than a non-Indigenous woman. It starts with discriminatory laws and policing and policies driving our people into discriminatory laws and policies driving our people into poverty. Not sure if you know, but 20% of all homeless people in Australia are First Nations peoples. We are only 3% of the total population, but 1 in 5 of us have nowhere to live. Homelessness leads to overcrowding and conflict. It is almost impossible to get a job when you have nowhere to live. Our people have to survive on social security payments, which are so low that they force our people to live well below the poverty line. These are the circumstances that government policies have forced many of our people into, and these are the circumstances that our kids are trying to navigate when they get into trouble. Our kids are born into families who love them and communities who do everything we can to keep our children safe, strong and well. But there are many forces that put our children in harm's way. At schools, at best, our kids are taught a history of Australia's invasion that they know in their hearts and their spirits is not true. At worst, they are taught in a language that is not their own. They face discrimination and hostility from their peers and sometimes from their teachers. And they are suspended and expelled at far higher rates than their peers. Getting pushed out of the education system is often the first step towards being poured into the criminal justice system. Our children are denied their basic human rights to education and come to the attention of police if they're out and about and not at school. There have been extensive research in Australia comparing the disproportionate rates at which our young people are surveilled by police, harassed and targeted. It's not a coincidence that many of our children are picked up by police than non-Indigenous children. To give you one example, in the state of New South Wales in Australia, the police have a special list called the Suspect Task Management Plan. This is a secret blacklist of names that the New South Wales Police use to watch and harass people that have decided that are at risk of committing crimes. In SA, we have Mandrake, which has been in place for many years, which is a similarly targeted police so-called intervention. And all it really does is creates more anger and more resentment between police and our communities. The thing is, in New South Wales, they have children as young as 9 years old allegedly on this list. That is who their suspects are. And let's remind ourselves that the legal age of criminal responsibility in Australia at this time is 10. When this list was finally uncovered and made public, it was revealed that over half of the names on that list were not hardened criminals. They were Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Our children are treated differently when they are called before the courts and are more likely to be locked up and held on remand than they are in comparison to non-Indigenous children. In fact, the vast majority of our children who are in youth detention centres are locked up on remand. That means that they are being imprisoned before they have even been found guilty of a crime. A report released a couple of years ago found that the majority of children being held on remand later went on to be released when they had their matters heard before a judge, and that they should never have been behind bars in the first place. There are many other complex drivers that put our children at risk. Our kids are more likely to have undiagnosed disabilities. Many suffer from trauma and are more likely to have hearing and cognitive impairments, all of which place them at risk of unfair and discriminatory treatment. Children's legal representatives and or social workers, caseworkers do not appear to be aware of these issues, nor further investigate or seek to gain reports to present these before the courts. And hearing impairment is also one of the major causes that we understand about our young children being disengaged from education. So for many years, First Nations peoples have been campaigning to see the laws that hurt our children abolished. We've been fighting for the age of criminal responsibility to be raised from 10 to at least 14 years of age. But so far, only one of Australia's 8 states and territories has heeded our calls and agreed to raise the age. Canberra has also agreed to raise the age of criminal responsibility and have said that probably approximately 12 months ago, and yet we are still yet to see that actually come into place. Every step, our people are targeted by the system. So I just want to share with you some of the statistics, because I like to try and talk about being strengths-based, but when you look at these statistics, it's actually very hard to actually really promote that. And you know, we are 10 times more likely than non-Aboriginal Australians to be policed, arrested, charged and prosecuted. We are 18 times more likely to be imprisoned.
We are 26% of the prison population, despite being only around about 3% of the population. In the last 10 years, the number of Aboriginal men in prison has tripled, and the number of Aboriginal women has increased by 420%. Our children are 26 more times likely than non-Aboriginal children to be incarcerated. And in some jurisdictions, our children are over 40 times more likely to be imprisoned. You can guess which state and territory I'm probably talking about when we look at the Northern Territory in particular, where imprisonment rates rate very highly in the context of 90 to 100% of children in prison are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. The rate at which Aboriginal children are taken from their parents is now twice the rate and at the time of the federal government's apology, and greater than any time in Australian history, including during the stolen children generation itself. This is yet another way that the system which was designed to steal our children from us continues to do so. So what can we do about it? Imprisoning people for so-called crimes of property like not paying parking fines, is a deliberate policy choice. Criminalising so-called public nuisance offences, like being drunk in public, and doing so when you know for a fact that the only people who will be pleased with these offences are blackfellas and poor people, is a deliberate policy choice. Putting heavily armed police in our communities while drastically underfunding our health, education and other much needed services is a deliberate policy choice. Locking up 10-year-old children is a deliberate policy choice. Spending billions on prisons and building new prisons and police, rather than investing that money in early intervention type programs to keep people and avoid people going into the prison system, is a deliberate policy choice. All these policy choices carry forward the legacy of colonisation, and they have to change if our future is going to look different to Australia's shameful past. If the government are serious about closing the gap, like they say they are, we need reform at every level. This means not just fixing the pointy end of the criminal justice system, but also fixing the housing affordability crisis, the below poverty level Centrelink payments, and the lack of funding for community legal and family violence prevention services. Don't get me wrong, there's plenty of reform that is needed in the police, prison and judicial system. For a start, all governments could commit to raise the age to 14 years of age, and more recently, we as I said, have been advocating very strongly for greater investments for Aboriginal community control in regards to the way and decision making about the way money is spent within our communities. There's a lot of waste of funding that we see as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities that go to services that cannot engage or provide culturally safe services for our communities. So what we're saying is invest in our communities so that we can develop and I suppose localise the type of programs that are needed within our communities, rather than having a one type prototype program that is regurgitated in communities, time after time. Over the last few months, we have handed the Attorney Generals at the state and Commonwealth level with over 200,000 signatures from members of the community calling on them to raise the age. So we asked the question, why are they dragging their feet on a reform that would change the lives of a whole generation of our children? Why wouldn't we try to break the intergenerational cycle of incarceration and offer a therapeutic and empowered community-driven responses, rather than the continual and costly criminalised ones that we know that are just not working? Another critical immediate step that we need governments across this country to take is to reform bail and sentencing laws and stop sending our people to prison because of trauma and poverty. In Victoria, changes to bail and remand laws have heavily impacted on women and children who are now sitting in prison waiting for their trials and often spending more time there than what they would even receive a sentence for. We also need to address the endemic racial profiling that takes place in the police force. Police routinely target our people, and this is a key cause of over-imprisonment. Racism in the police force is a complex problem to tackle, and again, we need to start by recognising the colonial legacy of this system. I'm not talking about a few diversity cultural awareness days. I'm talking about deep and fundamental changes to the ways that police operate, including structural changes to how we hold police accountable. We should be collecting racial profiling data on stop and searches. If police are going to have to wear body-worn cameras, then they must be held accountable if they turn them off. We are on a trajectory across this country of ramping up police powers. We need to reverse this trend. But it's not just the police and prison systems that need to change. We need governments to start looking seriously at a number of policy failures that are driving our people into poverty and into the criminal legal system. When addressing offending, the system is really only focused on the crime and does not provide sufficient support for the causal factors. We are facing a housing crisis in Australia, and with so many things, the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the huge inequities that already existed in our communities, and none more so than the housing crisis. We saw First Nations families, particularly in remote regional areas, forced to sleep in tents, yards and on verandas and in the bush to try to avoid infection as the virus spread through families and communities. One of the good things that we did see through that were strong decision making by our communities to close down their communities to try and keep communities as safe as possible. We know that overcrowded and poorly maintained housing is well established as a cause of poor physical and mental health and a major risk factor for increased spread of infectious diseases. But of course, it's not just during pandemics that the housing crisis hurts First Nations people, it's all the time. During the pandemic, we saw the homelessness people being housed, and the question is, why can't this continue to happen? Again, this is a policy choice. 1 in 3 are homeless in the month before they are criminalised and locked away in prison. Almost the same number become homeless on their release. Why? Because we are now seeing the evolution of government policies denying those eligible for home detention or are released from prison because they cannot return to families living in government housing or community housing as an example. Again, this is a policy choice. Women, and particularly First Nations women, in violent situations are forced to choose between having a roof over their head but living in danger, or leaving and facing homelessness due to chronic national affordable housing shortages. These injustices are results of governments refusing to address the housing crisis and provide more affordable and community-controlled housing for our people. We welcome the Albanese government's commitment to provide affordable housing in remote communities, but it is not enough. We're calling for urgent large investment in affordable housing so that everyone has somewhere to live. We're also calling for the reform of the social security system so it's a genuine safety net for people who need our support and not a poverty trap. Right now, as we know, many Australians on Centrelink are on centre payments are set so low that they push recipients below the poverty line. People cannot afford to buy groceries, pay rent. They're forced to choose between buying medicines and buying their kids' school uniforms. Rural and remote communities face higher cost of living because of freight, and yet their benefits remain the same, and we are seeing more families being punished due to neglect rather than looking at how we address the high cost of living pressures on those living below the poverty line. And it's really important to note that when we talk about neglect is a high causal factor of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children being removed from their families. More and more, we are criminalising poverty. We remove the children, adding further lifelong trauma, and the intergenerational cycle of punishing those who live in disadvantage continues. Punitive discriminatory schemes like Parents Next force young parents, often young Aboriginal mums, to comply with onerous mutual obligations in exchange for a Centrelink payment they cannot even live off. It's humiliating, it's ineffective, and it's hurting our people. Now, people shouldn't have to live in poverty and homelessness, but policy decisions are driving us there. There are many changes like this that I could list, and these solutions are not complex. Give people enough money to afford food and accommodation. Provide affordable, decent housing so people have somewhere to live. Don't punish people for being poor. Provide them with support and services. The policy solutions are simple, but it's the political will that is hard. We need to convince politicians that there is public support for change, and with the over 200,000 Australian people who want governments to stop locking up 10-year-old children, then why are we not being listened? Recent polls show that most people support for a voice to Parliament to give us a say in the decisions that affect our lives. And more people are calling for a fairer housing system that doesn't lock people out. Politicians and lawmakers create this mass incarceration crisis. We believe at Change a Record that together we can solve it. We need a systemic overhaul, and you can make a difference by joining us and signing up to our website to raise the age. You can also make a difference by voting yes and encouraging families and friends to do so, by holding conversations about the importance of having First Nations peoples included in the Australian Constitution. Aboriginal people were purposely omitted at the time of the development of the Australian Constitution. And now more than ever is the right time to correct that wrong. Having a voice to Parliament is imperative for this country to firstly face its harsh treatment of its First Nations people, evident through the high incarceration rates, the high numbers of Aboriginal children being removed from families, and the unacceptable levels of family violence, and the levels of intergenerational trauma, the high levels of racism we continue to experience in our own country. The question that we need to ask ourselves is Australia ready to mature as a nation? And are we really ready to now walk the talk about making a difference for First Nations peoples in this country? So in closing, just thought I'd remind us about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make the statement from the heart. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture, from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to the science of more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day hither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil letter of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? The peoples possessed the land for 60 millennia, and the sacred link disappeared from world history in merely the last 200 years. With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alienated from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them, and our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for our future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly that the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We see constitutional reform to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and trustful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We see a Makarrata Commission to supervise the process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, and I will say 2023, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. Thank you.
I'm sure you'll be available to answer questions. Would you like to sit here?
Yep.
So there are so many things to think about in what we've heard. Do people have any questions? And if you do, Fergus has a microphone which he'll hand to you. Anybody would like to ask anything or clarification?
I've been wishing that they would raise the age to 14 for my children were that age. What is the objection to doing it? Like that's only a sentence would do it. Why hasn't it been done?
I think what we're looking for, I suppose, is a champion, with any Attorney General across Australia. I think governments are very nervous, particularly our government, and our states and territory governments. And when we look at internationally, other countries such as Finland, I think Sweden, there's quite a number, have actually raised the age and have done so for many years. So I think the cause of concern is, one, because there's been a lack of investment in early intervention and prevention, about where can funding be provided to be able to create those opportunities. To me, the answer is quite simple: reduce the investment you're making in prisons and police, and put that back into prevention, which is something that, I don't know why governments think that costs a lot more money. And I think when we look at self-determination and actually having funding within communities, having local governments, state governments, communities working together, I think we could really reach some really good and positive outcomes. But I think one of them just waiting for the other to do it. There's been a national conversation with all the national attorney generals, which has been going on for about 4 years now, where they were actually meeting to determine whether or not they're going to raise the age of criminal responsibility. Nationally, I think they were all reaching a level of 12, that they may go to 12, not 14. But if you do that, it won't make a difference. We'll still have around about 80%, I think, of children still being detained within the age group. Yeah.
The age of criminality is the same for all children, isn't it?
Yes.
So white children could be incarcerated at 12.
Yep.
So is there any sort of reason you can think of why they keep it at that age, but more of the kids incarcerated are Aboriginal?
Yeah.
Do you think it's got a racist basis?
Well, I don't think it's a racist basis. I think
What we've got is the impact of policies that actually impact more on First Nations people. And it's true, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal children would greatly benefit. If we want to have a future generation, and I've worked in child protection, I managed the Metropolitan Aboriginal Youth and Family Services at the parks for about 5 years. I managed a Families SA office at Salisbury for 2 years. I see myself, sitting on that side of the fence, I can actually see what the drivers are that bring children into the system. That may be necessary, that if we did something different, through early intervention prevention, investing more in families, particularly those who are struggling and living in poverty, rather than punishing them, then we would actually have, I think, more children going through education. They wouldn't be actually pulled out of the education system because, of either coming into the child protection system or being removed. And the levels of family violence would change because we'd actually have supports for parents to be able to deal with some of the issues that they're faced with.
No.
One of the things that struck me, hard to believe, more children are being taken away from their parents than during the stolen generation. Why can't somebody do what we did with the stolen generation, declare, that's it, let's end this stolen generation process that's going on now? It's horrible.
It's horrible.
Is there any kind of leader who's likely to stand up just for that, just like we did with the stolen generation?
Well, the issue that I talked about was neglect being a determining factor for removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Also, family violence is another big criteria now that we're seeing so many Aboriginal children being removed, and working at the Aboriginal Legal Service, but also working with some of the families, mothers who are trying to escape family violence, and it's a bit difficult when you're living within an Aboriginal community context, because like you're well known within communities, not like mainstream communities where people can actually escape, or they have to leave their country. They have to leave their families and their supports to be able to escape family violence. But what we see is even when mothers, this happens all over the country, have sought police assistance, they're often not believed, or there is a warrant check done on mum, and then mum is also arrested at the time when she's crying out for help. So what we're seeing is, a lot more families who are living and dealing with it because of the fear of children being removed. But we're also seeing a high number of children now also being removed. So we're punishing victims, in my view.
Yes.
We're punishing victims. And this is what happens with legislation, is that the impact, that maybe what the intent was, in actual fact it actually does actually have a bit of a further devastating effect. And we need to review, and we need to look at how we can actually have more family support programs, I believe. And we also need to have men held accountable for their behaviours. But we also not just have a system where we're locking them up. There needs to be some sort of program that's available, so men actually go through that and understand what their behaviours and understand the impact that it's actually having on the children. Because what we're seeing in particular, there's a lot of evidence now is demonstrating that a lot of children are becoming traumatised when living within a family violence situation. So I understand governments wanting to protect children, but you're further traumatising children by removing them out of their families and communities. So we have to look at the greater good, and I think the government's becoming more risk averse rather than actually looking at what's in the best interest of communities. And I think that's where we need to challenge our ministers and politicians, because changes can only come through them. We can lead, we can call for as much change as possible, we've been doing that, but we need mainstream Australia to also do that, because that's the only time change will happen.
Judy again.
I think in Vanuatu for a period of time, and one of the customs of the Melanesian people there was that if someone arrived on your doorstep, you took them in, and that often presented problems with rental accommodation. I worked with a lady who's made it a term of her rental accommodation that nobody from her family were allowed to come. Is that a custom in the Aboriginal community too, that...
Cultural obligation.
Hmm?
Cultural, we call it cultural obligation.
Obligation.
So there is a cultural obligation. And when you look at overcrowding, and it's interesting because, I think it's about how we see things and through eyes, whose eyes we see them.
Mm.
So when we talk about overcrowding, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, we've always lived closely together and with together. I lived, a short time with my grandmas and aunties, it's not, it's just part of our culture. And I think that's the sort of question that keeps coming to account is, then why are we not building housing to accommodate, our cultural our cultural, not just obligations, but, you know, so that we can actually feel that we're living in an environment that actually meets our needs. You know, so we actually have a lot of mainstream structures and decisions imposed on us, but we actually don't take the time to actually look at how that does impact on us as a community and on our culture. And I think there's some of the things that people don't think about until we actually start talking about them. You know, like let's have purpose-fit homes with bigger bedrooms and bigger blocks so that we can actually accommodate, you know, families to be able to live together. Or let's think about when we're actually building homes, you know, and whether it's public housing or community housing, whatever, you know, what are the needs, you know, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's families, so that we're not calling it overcrowding. But you know, when we look at overcrowding, you know, to us, to many of us, it's not overcrowding. You know, it's living in the community. So it's really interesting topic, that one.
These issues that you've raised about accommodation, about incarceration of children, not only children, incarceration of adults as well, have been going on ever since colonisation, with reports and investigations and royal commissions and a whole lot of recommendations, but still it remains the same or even getting worse.
Yeah.
So do you think a voice to Parliament is going to fix any of this stuff?
That's the question we should ask.
Well, we've got Closing the Gap as an example, and I was involved nationally also. So I was involved in the Uluru Statement of Heart, both here in South Australia nationally, and same with Closing the Gap. And I was one of the many that actually asked to meet with Prime Minister Scott Morrison to actually change the trajectory about Closing the Gap, and that we actually set the targets. You know, and that we do that with our service providers, our Aboriginal community organisations in particular, who provide those services, because they are responsible for service delivery within our communities. And you know, we've seen a commitment for the first time with Closing the Gap, where governments, Aboriginal community organisations, local government, state and federal governments are all sitting around the table. We've never had that before. So whether we'll see, and I suppose what's informed Closing the Gap is that the targets where Aboriginal community controlled organisations who have expertise in whether it's child protection, family violence, you know, law and justice, health, were able to work together and to actually shape the type of targets that they wanted to meet, the government to meet. The proof of the pudding will be, you know, we're what, I think probably a couple of years now into a 10-year commitment for Closing the Gap. But we also had previously ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, and each of the communities, and I was actually a Torres Strait Islander, an ATSIC commissioner in South Australia as well. And what happened, we had 3 regional councils in South Australia, and they actually were representatives, so people who actually went through the Electoral Commission to become nominated by the community members to be the representatives. And then what we had is those 3 bodies coming together at a state level as well to inform and, I suppose, develop planning in the context about what the needs were for each of our communities and what we wanted to see happen. What was missing from that was the commitment that we're seeing in Closing the Gap, where we had government sitting around the table to sort of make that happen. So I suppose in a long, short answer, it really depends on the way that the voice is shaped and how that our direct voice to Parliament will mean that we're not going through layers of government to get our voices heard. We'll be actually sitting at the table there with politicians to be able to try and drive change. Because at the end of the day, I think we need to all be clear that ministers in particular, who hold portfolios, have a lot of say about what happens in their portfolios. So having that influence, I think, is a positive start. But for me, when I think about the recognition in the Constitution, one, we're finally being recognised as First Nations peoples of this country, and we are actually having, ourselves included in the Constitution, which I think is very important. It doesn't impact on our sovereignty, it doesn't impact on our rights as First Nations peoples of this country. I think that's what a lot of First Nations people may be a little bit concerned about. They think that may impact on, but the legal advice is that it won't. But what it does do is it means if we have a voice, that it can't be taken away like Axleby was by the stroke of a pen. It means it'll be enshrined, and it means that you have to go through another referendum to remove those rights that we would have. And to me, I think that's a very important first step.
Yep.
And of course, if we can do that, and if the rest of Australia supports that and realise that this isn't about having an apartheid approach, this is really about trying to get equality by us having a voice direct to Parliament, which is really important for us if we want to change the trajectory that we're seeing at this time.
Thank you. I'd like to talk about a positive thing that Meredith and I have been involved in, which is a school that's been built in Woodville. Do people know about Nudu College?
Very much.
Yeah. Well, the principal of that school was the principal at Axleby Gardens, I think it was, which had a high proportion of Aboriginal students. And he developed policies and different ways of working and vertical grouping of students, so it was more like a family system, and it related well to Aboriginal people. And I think he was there about 12 years, and it was a great model. And the education department said to him, "We don't want you to do that anymore." So he decided, okay, well, he'll start his own school. He won't be part of the education department at all. So he negotiated with a whole lot of benefactors, and they bought the old Faldings factory over in Woodville, 2 huge buildings. And a couple of years ago, they developed one building into primary classes, and it's the most beautiful school. And it's a fee-paying school, but people contribute so that most of the Aboriginal children don't actually pay fees, but they have the benefit of a fee-paying education. And sort of visiting the school, the children are happy. They have a really positive image. You can go into a certain room and there's a whole lot of children's essays on a table. And there's a big sign above it saying, "We are authors." Or you go into another room and there's children's artwork. "We are artists." You know, everything about the school is really creating a positive image for those Aboriginal children. Now, at the moment, I think there's something like 40% of the children are Aboriginal, but they're hoping to make it more. Well, they want at least 51% Aboriginal, so it's a predominantly Aboriginal school. But it is just amazing, and I think that's another way for changes to be made to really support these positive moves, which give Aboriginal people a really strong self-image, which is a total change from what we hear about of the way things are being done and creating negative self-images for Aboriginal people.
Yeah, and the reinforcement of the negative stereotype of an Aboriginal person.
Yeah, well, this school is just amazing.
Great.
You said it's not part of the education department.
No,
There you go.
no, it's a private school. This teacher,
But they recognise it.
well, they've recently been registered or whatever it is you have to be,
Yeah.
and now they do get some
Yeah.
Commonwealth funding, I think it is. But no, it started off as a private school with no support from government at all, but a lot of benefactors who want to see these kind of changes made.
Yeah.
But it is quite remarkable and it's very positive, and just at the end of last year they put on a musical performance. Mate, by the way, all the kids have to learn Kaurna language. It's a Kaurna language school, so that in itself is a very important aspect. But they put on a concert down Port Adelaide somewhere along the river. It was the most beautiful outdoor concert with all the children in the school being involved in various ways, and they all learn music at the school. If you walk around, we've been to some open days, there are kids walking around with trumpets playing and kids over here singing. You know, it's just a really happy environment. And the classrooms are totally different to any classroom I've seen. Having both of us been teachers in our past, every room has a beautiful big dining room table in the middle of the room with nice dining room chairs. And the children sit around that. They're not at desks and regimented. It's like a family setting. And then on each side of the room, there's an arch, and you go through the arch, and there are big armchairs where 3 or 4 kids can sit and talk about what they want to be talking about in terms of what they've got to write or the work they've got to do. So it's a real family environment, but the main thing that I got from it is that it's so positive and empowering of the students who obviously love being at the school. And, you know, it's a good thing to support. I better shut up.
Actually, it doesn't make any difference whether you've got the microphone or not, your voice is
I don't need the
so
microphone.
powerful.
Sorry about that.
Any other questions?
Yeah,
Or,
any burning
Before-
questions?
before we
probably
finish.
better wrap up.
yeah.
Anybody else got a question?
No.
Or a comment or anything?
Yeah, make sure you put it next to your mouth.
Just there.
And Don's on afternoon tea duty,
Oh, yep.
so we are going to have tea and coffee.
Just want to say thank you for having me come on, and you know, whilst I've focused a lot on what's actually happening, you know, in the context of the incarceration crisis that we have, there are a lot of strengths within our communities, and this is why we've been actually asking for self-determination to tap into, to receive funding so we can actually develop our own programs, because we know that our programs will better meet the needs of our people. And you know, there's great strengths in our communities. We have a lot of children going through universities now, more so than we've ever had. We're having a greater number of children, you know, who are actually finishing higher levels in high school than they ever have been before. So, you know, I just want to paint the picture that we still have a long way to go, so that actually does impact more of our people. And you know, my ultimate wish, relating back to my dream, you know, is that I believe that through the voice, that we can actually start making even greater headways going into the future.
Thank you, Cheryl. And those who planned the March series of these Seminary of the Third Age sessions really wanted to focus on people's lived experience. And I don't think we could have any better example of lived experience than Cheryl talking to us today with her wide experience in a whole range of areas. And we do want to thank you for what we could say is a very confronting address, but a very necessary one. And we do want to thank you for sharing your experience, your knowledge in this whole range of areas, and your insights and your passion for doing something about what's a very serious problem in Australia. So all the best for this year.
Thank you.
And we hope that changes are made.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next week.
Oh, next week, Margaret Gunn is coming. I'll just tell you a little bit about her. She is a lecturer in TAFE, teaches mainly English for migrants or non-English speaking background people. But years ago, when there was a detention centre in Woomera, a Uniting Church minister was chaplain to the detention centre, and he worked with a lot of people in the detention centre and also wrote lots of emails to the government with less than positive responses about the fate of the people in the detention centre. And Margaret Gunn heard about this, so wrote to him a supportive email. And he wrote back saying that that was the only supportive email he'd ever received doing this work in Woomera. So they established a relationship, and over years, Tom kept all the emails from the government, from the inmates, from this and that, and Margaret worked with him, and she's recently written a book. Before he died, which is just a couple of years ago, she got his permission and his wife's permission to write all this up into a book. And the book has been just about, well, it's finished being written, but Mediacom are publishing it, and she's not quite sure whether it will actually be published by next Sunday. I don't think so. But just between you and me, for a launch, she wants to actually launch it on the footpath outside the immigration centre. She's a little bit of a provocative activist, but I think that would be a great idea. And I did encourage her and said, well, you could launch it there, and you could have some reporters there, so you would actually get wider publicity. So I don't know whether that's going to happen or not. But anyway, she'll be here speaking about her involvement in this project and about the work of Tom Atherton and the interaction with the government and the people from the detention centre. Initially, there was an ex-refugee going to come as well, but his family have become very alarmed that he's doing it and feel that they'll be targeted by Iraqi people that live in Adelaide. So he's backed out of it, but certainly Margaret is still coming to present all the information. So, and I think it will be a really great event. So yes, next week. That's probably about all.
Okay.
So, tea, coffee, a biscuit, and hopefully see some of you next week. And great thanks to Cheryl for her participation today.